Good evening, and welcome to tonight's virtual author event with Uncle Bobby's Coffee and Books. I'm Alicia Garza, and I am honored to bring you tonight's author talk. Alicia Garza is here to tell us about her new book, The Purpose of Power: How We Come Together When We Fall Apart. And she's joined in discussion by Sunny Hostin. Very exciting. If you haven't already gotten your copy of the book, you can order it from the Uncle Bobby's online bookshop by clicking the green button below the screen. Before we get started, I just want to thank everyone for showing up here tonight. As you may be aware, a Black man was just yesterday brutally shot to death by a police officer right here in Philadelphia. Another name in a growing list, and our city remains in a state of unrest. For so many of us who are continuously mourning, and for those who've taken to the streets in continuous struggle, this conversation, this book, The Purpose of Power, could not have come at a better time. After the discussion, the floor will be open to the audience question and answer session. So if you have a question that you'd like to ask, please click the Ask a Question button below the screen to submit yours for our panelist selections. Without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce this evening's moderator. She is an Emmy Award-winning journalist, author, and the co-host of ABC's The View. It's Sunny Hostin, and our featured author, Black Lives Matter co-founder, principal of the Black Futures Lab, and author of The Purpose of Power: How We Come Together When We Fall Apart, Alicia Garza.
Well, I am so honored to be here with my dear friend, Alicia. This is my favorite book that I have read. And I think to echo what was just said, it is so timely, Alicia, so important. Your work speaks for itself and is so necessary. And I think it certainly is a guidebook for young activists, old activists as well, going into what we know that we're into. So let me ask you, tell us about your book. Why did you write it? I know why you wrote it, but tell everyone here why you wrote it. And what do you hope that readers will take away from it?
Well, first and foremost, thank you, Sunny. Thank you for being here tonight. Thank you for agreeing to moderate this conversation. And thank you to Uncle Bobbies for hosting us. And shout out to our brother, Mark Lamont Hill. We always got to give a shout out to our brother. And I also want to shout out the community in Philly. I've been following all the news since last night. And I know that in these moments, it feels like we're in an endless cycle. And so I just want to send my heart and my spirit out to you all and encourage you to keep fighting and keep resisting. And to your question, Sunny, that's exactly why I wrote this book. I thought when I started to write this book that it was going to be a different book. I thought it was going to be a story about BLM and how it came to be and what our vision is and myths and facts and all the things, right? And when I started writing the book, it actually became much different. And I'm so, so glad that it did. Because as we can tell from the recent events, but also from the last 7 years, Black Lives Matter and the story of this movement is still being written. But I thought what would be helpful in this moment is really some time to reflect on what I've learned over the last 7 years, what I'm unlearning, what I'm still learning, and to bring forward a book that really pulls back the curtains on how change happens. So much of how we see movements, the most visible part of movements is usually protests. And people ask all the time, well, what happens after the protest? And I have to assure people there is work happening. There's work happening before, during, and after. And protests are just the most visible part, but it's the glue in between that actually helps us advance these movements for change. And so I wanted to offer this book humbly in that spirit. And I didn't want to do that without placing myself in it. There are so many books written about Black Lives Matter. and they're written about us, but they're not from us, right? I was so proud of Patrice a couple years ago when she put out her memoir, When They Call You a Terrorist, because I think it gives an in-depth view as to what we think from our own mouths, what we're fighting for, why we're a part of these movements, what has shaped us. And also, frankly, an offering to all of us who are thinking about getting involved in a movement for change, who maybe were involved and have been involved for a long time, but maybe we needed a little jolt to get back in. Or, for people who are trying to figure out how to get started. I wanted this to be a tool and a compass. And when I finished the book, I realized this is exactly the book I would have wanted when I was starting to get activated and when I first became an organizer. And so I hope that this book really serves that purpose for folks who are just joining now.
Let me ask you this. Excuse me. In August 2013, after the acquittal, sorry.
That's okay. Get your cough on, get some water.
Right here. So, after the acquittal of the man who killed Trayvon, you wrote this on Facebook. Black people, I love you. I love you. Our lives matter. And you and I have spoken about this. You say it was sort of your love letter to Black people. That became sort of the hashtag heard around the world and the beginning of a movement. What have you learned in the years since that post went viral? Because it really went viral. I didn't know you then, but I was like, oh my goodness, this is it. Are there ways in which you think the movement has evolved that surprised you? Because I would imagine it has surprised you. That it
Absolutely. I mean,
life of its own.
It did. I mean, I like to tell people that two things. I mean, number one, hashtags don't actually start movements. And it's true that this Black Lives Matter did go viral. And when Patrice put a hashtag in front of it, I had no idea what that was. I'm like a lot more old school. I was not really on Twitter. I mean, I've been on Twitter since 2009, but I didn't really know how to use it. So I was like, girl, why are you putting a pound sign in front of these words, right? I mean, this wasn't designed for social media. It was really an opportunity to help consolidate a conversation, but to also encourage people to do more than like it or share it or retweet it. And I think we really found the opportunity to get people where they were already having this conversation and encourage people to take the conversation offline. And, 7 years later, there's so much I've learned about what it takes to build power. And the reason that I titled this book, The Purpose of Power, is that I really wanted us to focus on that. After 7 years of hearing all kinds of analysis about this movement, one of the things that I hear really often is that one thing that people have a hard time grasping, right, is how this isn't actually about good people or bad people. It's about power, and it's about who has it and who doesn't. It's about how people get power and how they're kept away from power. And the whole purpose of movements is to put more power into the hands of more people. And I think I've learned over the last 7 years that if we were more focused on power and less focused on personalities, we could go a lot farther. I think I've also learned that what is needed from us is to grapple with some of the things that are old lessons that reappear in new times. And, I always say, I really want us to make new mistakes. I want us to learn the lessons so we can open up new opportunities to learn more and not just keep going through these same cycles over and over again. And so what I tried to do in this book to that end is really try to grapple with how do we understand the landscape of power that we're operating in. And I start that process by placing myself in context. And I talk about how movements are not reserved for people who, are fighting for social change or fighting for social justice. that actually movements are shaping us all over the place. And my life was being shaped indelibly by a very powerful movement that has effectively consolidated power, and they are now exercising it in all of the most horrific ways. And that is the conservative movement. I mean, when I was growing up was really when that movement was becoming a force. And I want us to place ourselves in context so that we have a better understanding of how our ideas have been shaped, how our values have been shaped. You know, I talk in the book about how I came up during the war on drugs and how that landscape really shaped a lot of our current understandings of Black communities and what we deserve and what we don't. I talked about how, you know, I came up in the time of the, what I would call the pop culture wars, right? Where on the one hand, there was the moral majority and the focus on the family. And then the way that I was being raised, right, was through MTV. And that's when MTV had news. It's when I first learned about apartheid in South Africa. It's how I learned about the HIV/AIDS crisis. It's how I learned about famine in Ethiopia. It's how I learned about the fall of the Berlin Wall. And I think, you know, always we should understand that we are being shaped and have the opportunity to shape movements that are helping us make sense of what sometimes doesn't make sense. And it's shaping what we do about it. It's shaping every step that we take. And my hope in really focusing on that in this book, Sunny, is that we start to get some clarity about what we're fighting for. Yes, absolutely. We are fighting for Black people not to be murdered by the police or vigilantes. We are fighting for better healthcare. We are fighting for better jobs. We're fighting for all of these things. But ultimately, we are fighting for power. And power is fundamentally about the ability to make the rules and change the rules. And so if we thought about our fight in that context, what would shift? And those are some of the things that I offer in The Purpose of Power.
You do. And let me ask you this, because you said so many important things just now. And you mentioned conservatives, and you mentioned that movement and how they have a plan, right? And we see the plan. It's a grand plan, and it's methodical. And we've seen it now with the Supreme Court. We've seen it with a judicial packing of the court. We've seen it politically. We've seen it with redlining. We've seen it with redistricting. They know how to get power. And you also mentioned that we keep on making the same mistakes. Mm-hmm. How do you identify those mistakes? What are the mistakes that we as a community keep on making?
You know, the one that's just bubbling up for me right now, and then I talk about this in the book, I have a whole chapter on identity politics. Yeah. And, you know, I start off the book by talking about how I learned what was important in movements. And I learned that directly from my mother, who never identified as a feminist, but she 100% was a feminist. Mm-hmm. And my mother really believed that we belong to each other. And she practiced that in her life. And she raised me and my brother to act that way as well. And at the core of it from my mom wasn't labels like Democrat or Republican or feminist or whatever. At the core of it was a fight for dignity and a fight for survival. And I know that what women like my mom wanted more than anything was to be able to thrive, was to be able to kind of advance, right? And not in the like MTV Cribs sense, right? But in the sense of knowing that your needs were met, knowing that you didn't have to struggle, knowing that your kids were taken care of, knowing that you could pay your bills and that you were not one paycheck away from disaster. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, I think one of the things that we have to learn on the left and on the progressive side of the spectrum, the liberal side of the spectrum, wherever you are, is that sometimes we try to reduce everything to class, right? And we say that, you know, talking about gender or race or anything else is unnecessarily divisive. And in fact, after the 2016 election, there was a writer who published an awful op-ed in the New York Times calling for the end to identity politics. Right. And what I think we need to learn is that sure, fundamentally, the thing that connects us is that we all want to live with dignity. We all want to do more than just survive. But for some of us, there are distinct barriers that exist that shape that fight to achieve dignity and achieve survival. And some of us cannot choose to ignore, right, the fact that that we identify as women or trans or queer. And we can't ignore it because the world is shaped around making us acknowledge it at every moment. And I really want us to start to get and grasp that sameness is not the goal here. The goal is not for us to be homogenous. The goal is actually to be able to appreciate what makes us different, and also to analyze, right, where these categories came from and what their purpose was. The purpose of categories like race and gender and sexuality, all the ways that we talk about identity, is actually a mapping of power. And they are categories that were designed literally to write and inscribe who has power and who does not. And if we continue to see this as like people being too sensitive, or, people devolving into all of these little categories without actually stepping back and saying, well, what is the purpose of these categories and how is it changing the landscape for millions of people in this country, then we don't actually have a shot of bringing people together. We can't keep gaslighting people around what matters, because at the end of the day, a woman like my mother grew up at a time when the only available options for Black women were to be working in retail, to be a secretary, right, or to be a teacher. And even though my options as her daughter have shifted, there are still so many constraints that are based on superficial categories that are inscribed by law. They have nothing to do with good or bad people. They have everything to do with rules. And rules are inscribed by people who have power. And so if we want to change, right, these subjective categories, then we have to change the rules and we have to build power in order to do so.
And you write a lot about your mom in the book, which I love. How would you say she influenced who you are today, that relationship?
Well, earlier I said that my mom believed that we all belong to each other, and she really lived that. In the course of writing this book, my mom passed away, and I wasn't sure that this book was going to get done. And I realized that I wanted to center her so prominently in the book because she is both at the same time so simple and so profound. And when my mom was diagnosed very suddenly with brain cancer, it was a very fast deterioration. It was 7 weeks from diagnosis to death. And I'm very grateful that I got to spend those 7 weeks right by her side. I stopped everything. I was like, nothing else matters except being present with her. And in the last weeks of her life, people would come from near and far to pay their respects to my mom, to get to say goodbye. And I heard so many stories about how my mother acted as if we are all each other's responsibility. My mom and I were very close. We told each other's secrets. And there are tons of secrets that I will take to the grave and that she took of mine to the grave. But the things that I learned about my mom, for example, I have a family member who was going through a pretty painful divorce, and divorces are expensive. And so as he was going through this process, he really did not have a lot of extra income and really was having a hard time making ends meet. And he was not very open about this, right? But my mom knew. And so what she would do when she would go to the grocery store each week for the family is she would buy an extra bag of groceries and she would put it outside the front door. My dad didn't know. My brother didn't know. My mom didn't know. But she did this for almost a full year. And that is so her. Another family member of mine was struggling with addiction, and they went to rehab. And as a part of their rehabilitation process, they needed to go through therapy, and they needed to do that with members of their family, but they were estranged from their family, mostly as a result of their addiction. And so who showed up to do those therapy appointments? It was my mom. She never talked about that. She never told any one of us, and she wouldn't have, because for her, that is just what you did. You show up for each other, and we are each other's responsibility. And I use my mom and her colloquialisms in the book a lot because she makes it so plain and simple. And it really is. It's not as complicated as we hear and see on the news all the time, right? It is actually very simple. We do belong to each other. We depend on each other to survive. And frankly, we are stronger together than we are alone. And those all sound like colloquialisms, but at their core, they are some of the strongest building blocks towards how we get more power into the hands of more people. And so I'm grateful to my mom for imparting all of the lessons that she did to me, including all of her great colloquialisms like sex makes babies and babies are expensive, which was literally the best sex education a girl could have had. Telling me you teach people how to treat you, right? And also telling me at the same time that I could be anybody that I wanted to be. I could achieve anything that I wanted to, that I shouldn't take roles that were just reserved for women because I could do anything a man could do and probably better. And she also would say things to me about how to protect myself, knowing that I was a Black girl growing up into a Black woman in a society that violates Black women regularly. And all of that for me was shaping in terms of how I understand my own politics, how I understand my own values. And I think the offering here, right, is that there are so many things that connect us that are literal building blocks that are so simple, but they are deeply profound, just like my mom.
That was beautiful, by the way. Let me ask you this. Talking about identity politics, I often say that people want to know what you are in order to decide who you are and how they should treat you. And I think you write a lot about that in the book. And you write in the book that controlling the story of who we are and what makes us who we are is an exercise of power.
That's right.
And that really struck me. How can we learn then, in talking about power, to control the narrative, both on a personal level and on a national level? For me, that is the key. Right?
Agreed. Well, I think it starts off, honestly, by understanding who is shaping the messages that we internalize and the stories that we internalize now. And I think this is relevant for especially today, because as I was watching the news about what was happening in West Philly, the brother who was murdered by police officers, I keep seeing all of the same elements of the story.
Right.
And I realized that every time I see these stories, I'm like, these are not new. In fact, they're almost playbooks, right? The only thing that has shifted is that now we're capturing these murders on camera. But the stories remain the same, right? The stories remain that the officer was afraid for their life. He had a knife. He was charging me. And then when we start to get into the actual details, we realize that so little of that is actually true. And some of that has to do with the fact that, and Sunny, you know this as a former prosecutor, some of this has to do with the way that we tell stories about who Black people are in this country. And so many of the stories about us revolve around criminality. They revolve around being violent. And certainly, with the unrest and the uprisings that are happening right now and will likely happen for the time being, there will be more stories about how people are unruly, how there is rioting and looting, when what we don't ever deal with is what is the appropriate response to witnessing a man be murdered. We never tell that side of the story. And in this moment in particular, especially since this kind of second wave of BLM has kind of traversed across the globe, we're still seeing a lot of those same elements, and we're seeing the success of the conservative movement in really shaping the opinions of everyday people through stories. Their stories are that this movement is violent. Their stories are that this movement hates police. Their stories are all of these things that tap into the worst fears of people who maybe don't ever see protests in their community, but everywhere they get their news is how they're absorbing their values. And that is a source of power that I think at times we can discard and discourage. And it's something that we need to take full hold of. It does matter who's telling the story about what's happening in our communities. We saw that in Ferguson, Missouri, when Mike Brown was killed. And, you know, as many members of the media descended on that community that few outside of St. Louis had ever heard of before that incident, what we heard were the same kinds of stories, right? There's rioting, there's looting. And then we saw the National Guard come in, we saw rubber bullets and tear gas. And, you know, one of the things that we heard from activists and organizers in Ferguson was that they wanted to be able to tell their own story. I remember, watching CNN during the first days of that uprising and seeing people, actually, no shade to Don, but seeing people challenge Don Lemon on TV. Like, they would literally butt into camera frames and say, stop lying about what's happening here. Yeah. And that was so profound to me because I felt it. Because I've been a part of uprisings in my own community around Oscar Grant or whatever the recent name of somebody who was murdered is. And I've seen the same stories be told over and over again. I can tell you that with Rodney King, which I talk about in my book, and with Oscar Grant, those stories were not able to stick in the same way because people were finally able to see it with their own eyes. I tell the story about how a young man who interned with me at a community organization that I worked at for over a decade. He was interning with me through the Black Student Union, and he was learning about organizing, and we were fighting a campaign in the largest remaining Black community left in San Francisco, a campaign around gentrification and displacement. And we were fighting the stories that were being told about that neighborhood. And a year or so later, must have been about a year and a half later, he was the person who was on that BART train who had a cell phone camera and captured the footage of Oscar Grant being shot by Officer Johannes Meserly. And that footage ended up actually being used in the Ryan Coogler movie Fruitvale Station. But I can also tell you that that night, police officers tried to confiscate those cameras. And it goes to show you how powerful these stories are. And it goes to show you that if and when we are able to control our own stories, we are able to shift the locus of power in a different direction.
So the media also has a big part in this. So right. More representation.
That's right. I was taught I wasn't supposed to say the media. I'm supposed to say some media because people like you and Joy and, Melissa and all these other folks have really helped make sure that our voices were on these platforms and could help to shape the story differently. So some media.
I will say, Don Lemon is a good friend of mine. And I think he counts what happened in Ferguson as sort of a watershed moment for him in his career, and a
imagine
for him.
I can imagine. We all saw that transformation, and I think it really does lend to your point around the power of stories.
Yeah. Let me ask you, because what I hear often, I get the question, what can I do? And you answer it in your book. Hopefully, people will buy it and read it, but they better.
Yeah, you better.
It's a guidebook for this, but what is your advice to people, particularly young people, who want to be involved in real change? Because I have an 18-year-old son who is involved in protests and uprising. My daughter at 14 is as well. They want to be involved, I think, in real change, but might be overwhelmed, some of them, and they want to know where to start.
Yeah. Well, the thing I say in the book, and the thing that I will offer here for this audience tonight, is that there's a few things that we can do to start. I think the first thing is to find people who care about the things that you do and join them. Again, it seems so simple, but it is actually profound. There are so many of us in this country who see things that we know are wrong, but we don't know where to start, and we feel isolated. We feel like we're the only ones who see the things that we see, and we don't realize that there are entire communities that are forming of people who are being directly impacted by these issues that are shaping our lives, and they're coming together to do something about it. And so you don't have to be on the couch throwing your shoe at the television like I've been known to do so many times. You can actually join a community of people to both be connected and not be isolated in your anger, but also to transform that anger into a profound love for us and for what we can accomplish together. And that is what I actually think helps to take people to the next step. I think the second thing that I would just offer, and I can say this, after years and years and years of being deeply cynical about the possibility of change, while also spending all of my waking hours trying to create change, that you do actually have to choose whether you're cynical or whether you're hopeful. And I think cynicism, it's healthy. And especially when we're starting to realize all of the ways in which things are organized and have been organized in such a way that don't serve us, it is so natural to be angry and to feel like it is untouchable. And at the same time, if you stay there, it can be poisonous. It can be corrosive. Imagine being the person who, is always saying that things need to change, but you don't actually believe that change can happen. It's a huge contradiction. And not only does it interrupt your imagination, but it eats at you. And I talk about this in the book that, just to expand on that story a little bit, how I can remember times when I realized I probably wasn't that fun to be around either, because everything I was talking about was how evil things were. And it was almost like I could one up you on how evil a thing was, right? And how it could never change. And it always led us to the same place, which was silence, right? Yeah. Now I spend my time really investing in vision and possibility. And that does not mean that I am not crystal clear about how terrible things are. And I'm not crystal clear about how devastating things are. And at the same time, what helps me get out of bed every day is really investing in the possibility, and not the kind of possibility that's like hallmarky and doesn't have any of the real life to it. But I choose to spend my time in the place of being motivated by what can be, rather than being held back by the things that I don't think can change. And I want to be somebody who helps to realize that, not only in myself, but helps other people find that hope and that possibility. It is where I have seen the most creativity, the most innovation, is when people deeply believe that change can happen, and not somewhere down the road, not for somebody else, but for yourself and in your lifetime.
Well, I often say that alone we can survive. Together we certainly thrive.
That is right.
But it can come with grave consequences for yourself. Speaking up and standing up for even what you believe is right can come with grave consequences. I know you've experienced it. I've experienced it both in career and in your personal life. What do you say to those people then? I know I want to make change, but I don't want to lose my job. I don't want to get death threats. I don't want to have security. What do you say to those folks?
Well, I say, I hear you. I know that life in a serious way. And I was pretty candid this week that, I found out that that there were viable threats on my life. And, these are things that we know. I mean, we get death threats, we have to deal with all this mess, but it is something that can be incredibly disheartening and also super scary. And that's the point of that kind of violence. It is to try and deter you. It's to try to scare you. It's to try to get you to turn away and to cower. And the base of our power is in not cowering and in not capitulating. And, I say in the book a couple of things. Number one, movements are messy. And I try to be really honest about that. I think, when I first I got involved in the reproductive rights movement, and I got incredibly disillusioned, like 12 years into it, because I learned about the racism that has existed in that movement and the whole movement around eugenics, right? Which was also deeply, weirdly connected to reproductive rights. And it was all about survival of the fittest. And somehow it was only white women who were the fittest to reproduce. And it was women of color and Black women, right, who were not. And I got pissed. I thought, God, I've put all of my heart and my soul into this cause that I really believe in, because of my own experiences, because my mom, because myself, right? And I feel like I've been duped. And it took me a long time to come back around to that movement. And I will say that one of the things I've learned over time is that all of those things do happen because movements are messy. People will break your heart. They will disappoint you. There are times when people will not show up the way you think they should show up. There are times when you won't show up the way you want yourself to show up. Sure. And movements are messy because they are comprised of human beings, and humanity is messy. And we are literally trying to bring forward a world that does not exist yet, and we're trying to live it in real time. And that process is messy. And so I offer here that I think one of the things that is so needed is to develop a tough skin, but keep a soft heart, and know that these things are inherent to movements, and they're not just inherent to the one you're in. I'm not asking you to be a martyr for anything that's awful. I mean, trust me, I have had to draw a boundary in many a place that was not healthy for me. But I also encourage us to have that perspective and to say, we have to keep trying. We have to keep going at it again and keep trying to get it right so that we can unlock the next level, right? It's almost like a video game. You may go at a level 80 times before you actually pass it. And then it unlocks this whole other thing that you have to learn. And the process of getting there is kind of funky, but we still have to stay committed to it.
I want to go to some of these questions because we're getting a lot of them, but I want to ask you, we kind of touched on it, but, Walter Wallace Jr. shot in West Philly, not too far from Mark's bookstore. It's just unbelievable, right? I feel the same way you feel. Like we're just seeing it over and over again. I know on The View, we're just talking about it over and over again. When does it stop? Ongoing protests. And it just seems to me it's this ongoing issue of police brutality. And then I also see, again, women at the forefront. I mean, you see Walter's mom trying to de-escalate it there, right in front. Women are in front of the movement. And then you have officers, totally disregarding de-escalation tactics. They're making the same mistakes. And then we talk about defunding the police. And people want to take issue with the term, which is ridiculous. But that being said, what we're talking about, I think, when you say defund the police, you're talking about taking some of those resources, moving them to things like mental health, which would have been very helpful if you had someone with any sort of mental health training responding to this situation with Walter. What is your, we're getting it wrong, obviously, over and over again. And so we're living in this tumultuous time in our nation's history. You said you have some hope in the future. Well, let's talk about then this ongoing issue that we're seeing right here.
Yep.
Is protest going to work?
Yeah. I mean, here's the thing. Months ago now, the Movement for Black Lives drafted a piece of legislation called the Breathe Act. And it literally, I think, is this generation's version of the Civil Rights Act. And yet it's been hard to find a sponsor. And it is a very clear reprioritization of how we use our resources. And it is also a clarity around what public safety looks like, what it feels like, and how we operationalize it. The fact of the matter is, the brother who was killed yesterday did not have to die, and he should not be dead. And, I read the story of how his mother tried to de-escalate. And I know that feeling, right, of just complete anguish, knowing that it didn't have to end that way. And hearing this story over and over again, it's enraging to me, because we do have solutions in front of us. It's not that nobody can figure it out. It's that there's not the political will to change the rules that are protecting these officers to be able to use this kind of conduct in communities. But it's also, it's not even just about conduct, right? It's about a practice that doesn't actually keep us safe. Killing people who are in mental health crisis isn't keeping us safe. It's murdering people. And I think we just have to be honest about that. But we also have to be honest about our obsession with this notion that that police is the ultimate form of safety, when time and time again, we are seeing that that is not true. And again, that is not about, throwing barbs at your uncle or your dad or, your auntie, right? I mean, a lot of our families have law enforcement in them. And I'm going to continue to say that, policing is not designed to address mental health crises. And in fact, it's harmful to it. Policing is not designed for all of the things that we use policing for. And that is the fundamental contradiction that we have to address. And until we do so, more lives will be stolen, more lives will be lost. There will be more empty seats at the dinner table. There will be more children without parents. There will be more mamas who lost their babies before it was their time. And I just, it burns me up inside, because I know so clearly that there are rules that we can enact right now that can help to change this dynamic. And there is a lot of fear about doing that, because people spend their time in wordsmithing, because the police union is so powerful, right? Because of all of these certain factors that, frankly, lead to this endless cycle of violence, rage, grief, violence, rage, grief. And this is the purpose of power, not to be cheesy, but it's power that will change those rules. And what we know right now is that what's keeping the current power arrangement in place is powerful police lobbies, right? What's keeping the current arrangements in place is all the stories we tell ourselves about safety. And we really do need to shift that. And some of that has to do with building power on our side in terms of being able to change laws, but it also is very much about changing stories.
I'm going to go to some of these questions, as I can see it. Okay, one of the questions is, power is mediated by institutions, something the conservative movement has understood better than the left.
That's right.
How do we amass institutional power without being overtaken or co-opted by those institutions? That comes from Michelle.
That's such a beautiful question, Michelle. And I'm glad you asked it. That is exactly what we should be grappling with right now. And unfortunately, a lot of the gaps that we see on our end have to do with the intentional dissolution of infrastructure on our side of things. Even when we look at Black communities, the infrastructure that we need to be powerful in the political realm is very, very weak. And so as a result, it leads to not just co-optation, but I think because there is so little political infrastructure in our communities, it leads to a sense of being happy to be at the table rather than being ready to flip the table over. And that's a big challenge that I talk about in my book. I think, there was both the intentional destruction of our political infrastructure by government programs like COINTELPRO. But there also has been an absorption, right, of responsibilities of key institutions into nonprofits. And I think that one of the implications of this as well has been that some of what Black politics has started to look like since at least, the 1970s is so transactional. And in some ways it has become what I called patronage politics in my book. And I saw that very clearly in communities that I organized in, where folk knew exactly who they had to pick, right, to move their agenda, even if it was counter to the agenda that the broader community needed. So I couldn't agree with you more that part of what we have to do is really invest in building the kinds of infrastructure that can help us win. And I talk about the infrastructure that the right has built. You're absolutely right. They have built powerful media institutions, and they have spread out across TV, radio, right? And now more recently, social media. They have been able to activate inside of institutions that previously saw themselves as apolitical, like churches, right? Evangelical churches in particular, and now have been able to wield them as an incredibly powerful political force. They have also deeply invested in policy. They have deeply invested in policy. And I can tell you everything that is being adopted right now, they were testing 30 years ago. And they have done so in a way where they have been able to take control of 2/3 of state legislatures while everybody else is focused on what's happening in the White House. They are just, 2 or 3 state legislatures away from being able to call a constitutional convention. I mean, they have had a 50-year plan for power. And I think we would benefit from having the same.
Yeah, they're methodical about it.
Mm-hmm.
This is a question from Jared. What can we do to end the intersectional divide in the Black community and emphasize the fact that all Black lives matter?
I think this takes work, and I think it takes time. And the conversations that we're having right now are not the conversations that my mom's generation was having. And I am fully confident in that. And I did not tell this story in the book, but it's one that I think of often when I get sad about how I feel like progress is slow. I was on my way to work one day and I stopped at a local cafe to get a cup of coffee. And as I was waiting for that and my little breakfast sandwich, because I gotta get my nourishment in, I saw this teenage girl and her grandmother talking to each other in the corner. And I could overhear their conversation. And the teenager was breaking down gender pronouns to her grandma. And the grandma was looking at her and was really trying to get it, right? And my heart burst into a million pieces because I realized I don't know that I would have seen that 10 years ago or 20 years ago. And we are making some progress. And I do think it's important to see where our victories are to actually see how much farther we have left to go. And even in the days where I feel like we're really far, we've actually made a lot of progress. So I want to own that. At the same time, I've spent a lot of time tonight talking about stories, but I really want to hammer on this because some of these stories that we tell are stories about ourselves that were designed by someone else, but we share them and adhere to them with each other. And I think that is true amongst Black communities, not, uniquely, but certainly in our communities. We have all kinds of conversations that we need to move around. And, a lot of that has to do with time, place, and conditions, but a lot of it also has to do with the way we've been taught to understand our world. And we have also been taught to not talk about the things that are existent in our communities forever. So, I have said to people that I don't think there's a Black family alive that doesn't have a story about a relative who lives with the same-sex roommate that they've had for 20 years, and it's a one-bedroom, right? But that's their friend. You know what I mean? We all have these stories. Do. And so I want to keep pushing us, right? To some of it is really just about living out loud and challenging each other in real time, but doing so in a way where we can continue to bring each other along. There's also stuff that I'm learning now from the generation that's coming up, you know, after me, that is completely blowing my mind. And I consider myself to be, you know, well read and well exposed, and you know, probably as open as it comes. And there's things that I am learning too. And so part of this process of change has to do with having a long view, acknowledging how far we've come, but also adopting the practice of holding each other through change. And that doesn't mean not challenging each other. And it doesn't mean not sticking up or standing up for each other, but it is to say that I think the adoption of the world that we live in right now is really hard for some people. And that's not an excuse. It's just we have to keep being unapologetic about these conversations, but also making sure that we're bringing people along and not shutting people down because these are not frameworks or identities that they are used to or comfortable with or open about talking about. Because, you know, for some in their time, place, and conditions, that could mean death. That could mean a lot of different things. So I try to hold all of those things at once while also being very verbal and vocal. And you know, I will say there's a lot of places that I'm excluded from because I'm so unabashed about who I am. I'm unabashed about talking about queer and trans folks because I am queer and my partner's trans. And, you know, I don't get to shut this off so that you get comfortable. And at the same time, I want to encourage us also to show up for the messiness of those conversations so that we can move forward together.
This is on the list, but something you and I and our thread talk about, our group.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. You know, we talk about a lot of things, but
yes.
you know, this divide that, especially going into this election, that we see within our community between Black men and Black women.
Mm.
And what can we do to bridge that divide? Is it it's something that I was just discussing with my husband last night? Is it because Black men are experiencing this tumultuous time in a different way? Is it because you know, they want to get closer to this white male patriarchy that they have been excluded from for so long? The power of that patriarchy, where Black women have found power outside of that through collaboration. What is your answer to that?
Mm. You know, yeah, no, it's a great question, Sunny. And, you know, I'd be in different places about this at different points in time. You have caught me in mid-cuss, right? But today I'm feeling grace. And so, you know, I was having a conversation with a friend before coming on tonight. And something he said really struck me, which is in the political realm, Black men are not used to being courted. And that really like hit me in my soul because I think it's true. And it doesn't make it right or good or whatever. But I think that there is something to wanting to be wanted. And whether that be by white male patriarchy, right? Or whether it's just somebody asking your opinion about something and saying that what you have to say is valid. That is a real result, I think, of how long and how far, not just Black men, but Black people have been left out of the political process and locked out of the political process. And it is also one of the contributors, I think, to folk being able to step on the necks of Black women in order to get to a promised land that doesn't exist for either of us, right? And we're not even bringing in this conversation yet about, trans folks, right, who are really in danger right now, given this administration, queer folks, right, given the shifts in the Supreme Court that just happened this week. I mean, I'm feeling that on a whole lot of levels. And I will say too that, one of the things that is being exploited is our exclusion and our disenfranchisement, and the offering of having a voice and having a say, having power is incredibly alluring. Yeah. And so I think we have to take this seriously, especially in the political and electoral realm. I will be honest with you. I mean, the thing that I say all the time is that I don't think Republicans have anything to offer Black people. And, I'm sure I will get some Black Republicans in my DMs later talking about, you don't know what you're talking about. And that's fine. We can agree to disagree. I haven't seen it. That's since 1965, right? It's just, we haven't seen it. But at the same time, Democrats have taken Black folks for granted. I was on my Facebook today, Sunny, which, is like the devil's lair at this point. It's like where I get most of my death threats, and it's also where I connect with my friends, and it's awful, and I hate it. And, I was looking through my memories today, and one of the things that popped up was 4 years ago, we were demanding a Black Lives Matter debate from the DNC, and we were soundly rejected by Debbie Wasserman Schultz, who was the chairwoman at the time. And I mean, never mind that she was later ousted for trying to kind of rig the rules for Hillary Clinton, but it does. It bears noting that at a time of incredible change, when Black Lives Matter was ascending, and it was an opportunity to have the conversations that Black families across the nation wanted to have on national TV. Mm-hmm. And they soundly rejected it with no reason except, thanks for asking, and we don't need to do that. And yet we got a bunch of BS debates, right, where we couldn't even get candidates who could say Black Lives Matter, much less articulate from the sense of policy how to make Black Lives Matter. Mm-hmm. And it is the same cycle over and over again, where folks engage us symbolically, but don't engage us substantively. And so it's really easy for opportunistic politicians like Donald Trump and his ilk to come in and mask symbol as substance. And that's how we get Jared Kushner's comments yesterday, right? Where he, essentially says, well, Trump has all these things that he can do for Black people, but he can't do those things for Black people if Black people don't want them for themselves. And here again are those stories that are so salient. Now, child, nobody fights harder for Black people than Black people, but yet we continue to be susceptible, right, to these messages about us that weren't designed from us, but they continue to shape us and shape how we take action. And that is a little bit of how I think all of this has come to be.
Now, two other questions, but I'm going to combine them because they're sort of the same.
Okay.
In the midst of this perfect storm for chaos, what recommendations do you have for seasoned community educators / activists, newly minted, and folks not knowing where to act and get involved? The second question is, what can we as educators do to better inform our students and colleagues? So how do educators inform students and colleagues, and how do people get involved?
Okay, well, a couple things. One, I talked in the book about how the first time I had a Black teacher was when I went to university. That's a crime. Yeah. So for people trying to figure out what to do, one thing I just have to plug is to say we need more Black educators. And so whatever can be done to lend a hand, to be a mentor, to encourage, please do, because our students deserve that. Number two, of course, we're in an incredible hostile environment. And when I'm not doing a million other things, I do also have the chance to adjunct at San Francisco State. And, my students are so bright and brilliant. and I can see the impact of not having an education that helps them understand their world. And some of these students, come in at 30, 35, 40, some of them are late stage entering into the university system. And the information that they have is not equipping them for how to navigate an increasingly polarized world. And so, build this book into your curriculum because I think it is a very accessible way to help people understand how we got here and why it matters that you're involved and what you can do to get involved. I think the third thing that I would just offer here is that part of this hostile environment is that this president is trying to change the stories that weren't good to begin with. And he has a whole movement behind him. So I talk in the book about how in Texas, in school districts in Texas, they tried to change the curriculum to say that Black people weren't enslaved, that we immigrated here to work. Yeah. And so, and that is getting worse now with the, banning of, any kind of education around diversity and inclusion, which already doesn't go far enough, but certainly, this kind of attacks on our education system is really geared around attacking our movement. And then lastly, I would say, make your classroom a place and your university or your school a place where people see civic action as a part of their education. I've been lucky enough to teach classes on organizing, and they don't just learn theory. They actually get placed inside of organizations and do what those organizations do. And that is a requirement for them to complete the class successfully. And I don't think there's enough of those models out there. And so I would really encourage us to try and expand that. Those are a couple of quick things that I think we can be doing now.
Excellent. And I've gone over time. We were supposed to be done at 7:20. I'm sorry, everyone. It's 7:30. You have so much to offer, Alicia. And I think I just thank everyone for joining us. And I think Evisa has some closing remarks to give.
Excellent. Thank you, Sunny.
Oh,
and thanks to everyone who joined tonight.
Half an hour, but
we can keep going.
That was wonderful. Thank you both. A huge thanks to Alicia Garza and her team at Sky Blue Media. Also the publishers of Penguin Random House for making this wonderfully nourishing event happen. Thank you, Sunny, and thanks to your team as well for the wonderful insight that you lent. Once again, please get your copy of the book from Uncle Bobby's Bookshop, Purpose of Power. It's what we need right now. Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.
Thanks, y'all.